to it, you get a more effective state. So that seems to me the holy grail. And I'll finish on this, Tom. The issue, and I think Francesca alluded to this, she didn't allude to it, she said it quite strongly this morning. The problem is the paradox in all of this for us, because we want, as democratic socialists, whatever we are, we believe in and trust people, and so therefore we must have a diverse state, one in which people are able to locate themselves and participate because it's near to them, it's a proximity issue. And we want their involvement, but the issue of diversity means that we will have different outcomes. And that clashes with our other fundamental belief in equality. Now that is a paradox. We can't solve it, there's a tension between the two things. And that's why we need a kind of democratic foundation so that people are let into that paradox and let into that problem and can help solve it. And I can see David Walker sitting there, so I'll just finish on this. That, although I want that devolved, diverse state, and I'll always drink to the Temperance Society, but the issue is they're not going to stop global capitalism. They're not going to confront the banks. They're not going to confront the global corporations. Only the strong, central but democratic state is going to do those things. So how do we put that together? That's the challenge for the democratic left.
Thank you very much. Tim, I'll come to you. Is there anything amongst your remarks you'd like to say in defence of the last government's record in the context of what some other people have said?
In defence of the last government's record? I think many of their expansions of the state were actually a good thing and were supported by people. Tony Blair, we hear a lot of anti-state rants from him, but the Climate Change Act and his good action on climate change, the biggest extension of the state historically that I can think of, and when we look back in decades' time, how governments are needed to tackle dangerous climate change, it is going to be seen as an essential function of the state. Let me just pick up on a couple of points that have been made. Both Paul and John talk about relationships as important and relationships as being local, but relationships can be national too. I think people make a mistake if they think that a meaningful relationship is simply a face-to-face relationship. And yes, if you go back in our history, we did have a lot of local services, but in many ways I see the national services we got as an evolution of those, not a break with them where a government came along and did something to people. The NHS, yes, it was delivered by some ministers in Whitehall, but it was voted for massively in the election of 1945. And yes, it replaced the friendly societies at a local level. But truth be told, no one really minds that much about the disappearance of the local societies. Everybody loves the NHS. So we can feel a sense of agency in large-scale collectivism as well. Of course, the state can be distant at times. And when it is, one solution might be decentralisation. But another solution might be thinking, well, how can we give people that stake back? And what I'm talking about is a really strong phenomenon. I've been doing some focus groups around the country recently, and actually they were on something else, and I just found myself bunging in some other questions because I was a bit bored. And I went around the country and I asked people about the privatisation of the Coast Guard service. And people loathed this, and it didn't make a difference whether you were in a coastal location and might use the Coast Guard service, or you were in a landlocked location. People loathed the privatisation of forests, and it didn't make any difference if you had a forest nearby you. People had a national idea of forests and of a Coast Guard service of which they felt part. So we shouldn't underestimate the extent to which people can feel a sense of agency through large-scale collectivism. And I think it's wrong simply viewing these meaningful relationships that John and Paul are talking about as being local. On Facebook, I'm down as somebody who likes lots of things. I like the Labour Party, I like Amnesty International, whatever. These tens of thousands of people who like it like me, maybe I've got more in common with them than I have with my Portuguese neighbour. And I've got no problems pooling my risks with my Portuguese neighbour, but why can't I pool my risks with someone in Newcastle? I don't see this idea of relationships as having to be local. Let me just quickly say a couple of other things. I think, Neal, you picked up on the idea of state and civil liberties, and it's really important. I felt very queasy about a lot of the kind of authoritarian measures the last government did. I also, though, feel slightly sad at when opposition to that, and I'm not blaming you here, but some of the kind of popular opposition to that we had is dressed up as anti-government. I mean, authoritarian laws are government going wrong. And in fact, the way citizens are often protected from government is by a different arm of government. I think it's been a really sad phenomenon over the last decade that the civil liberties movement has grown up to be an anti-government force. You know, retail surveillance, corporations controlling internet content, corporations buying the intellectual property rights to the genome. All of these are ways the private sector poses a massive threat to our liberties, but you won't find anything about it on Liberty's website. You know, liberty is not just about drawing a line against government. Often we need government to protect those liberties. So, I agree in a way with what everyone said. There are ways that government can go wrong. There's ways it gets out of touch with people. But I think to frame this as being a fundamental problem with the state is misplaced.
Thank you very much. Sara, would you like to go now?
Well, I've asked to be polemic and short and to the point, and I'll try and do both. The first thing I want to say is we're not just having an argument in the left. This is an argument we're having with the Conservatives. And I really don't want people to lose sight of that, because we're in a very odd political time. We have market failure, which is palpable. Lots of people are very aware of this, not just in the UK, but in Europe, places like Greece, and this may spread to places like Portugal and various other countries. And yet, in the UK, the Conservatives are working from this ideological position that the state is bad. So we've got this conflation of two ideas, that the state is maybe bureaucratic and overinflated and the state is bad, as being the same thing. And the Conservatives are using this as a base from which they're making an awful lot of cuts. And that cannot be forgotten. And I very much like John's point that we need to start off with understanding what the state is about, what it's for. Because until the left can answer that question, we're not going to be able to counteract what the Conservatives are doing, and they're working from the position that the state is an inherently bad thing and we need to roll it back. Now, I think the Conservatives have stolen a march on this, particularly their ideas of big society. And I think if we're being candid, the big society is being used by the Conservatives as somewhat of a fig leaf for a lot of these cuts which are happening. As has been said by other members of the panel, society isn't just about what is happening in Whitehall, it's about Sure Start centres, it's about a lot of these other organisations that are operating at a local and not just a national level. As somebody who's a lawyer with things like legal aid cuts happening, cuts to Citizens Advice Bureau, for example, whilst it may seem an easy cut to make, it has a hugely detrimental impact on people. In terms of the evidence which has been given to the Justice Committee, it was estimated that for every £1 spent on Citizens Advice Bureau centres, it saves about £8. And not just that, it means people can stay in their homes, they get their welfare benefits. So we need to be very responsible when we're talking about the state, and we're not just positioning ourselves in this very navel-gazing way within the left. This is an argument that is happening with the right as well. Now, I just want to, again, reinforce this idea about what the Conservatives are asking for. What they're suggesting, and it's couched in far nicer language than this, is a complete abnegation in some ways of responsibility. They want to say that other people should be doing this, that power should be devolved. And I think on the left we have to be careful when we're talking about devolving power, that we make sure people are aware we're not necessarily talking about the same things. We're not talking about cutting services so far back that people don't have any support and they've got to do it themselves. And I'll end perhaps on this slightly trite observation. With the Conservatives, in some ways, quite a few of them are asking for us to vote for them so they can empower us and give us the power to make these decisions. I can't think of anyone else who would pitch for a job by saying, you pay me and give me the money, and I will give you the power so you can go do it yourself. And I think we have to be very aware that's what a lot of Conservatives are really saying.
Thank you very much, Sara. with my journalistic need to tease out a bit of disagreement or conflict, I thought what I'd do next is just ask everyone in response to what they'd said a quick question, and then maybe we'll throw it open for the last 20 minutes or so for questions, if that sounds all right. So, yeah, you'd rather go straight to questions? Well, I did want to ask you before I do, in particular, Paul. Just on Sure Start, you say it was this kind of syndicalist movement that the dead hand of Whitehall crushed. But I mean, really, it would have been crushed because of lack of money. Picking up on some of what Sara was saying there at the end, in any event, wouldn't it? And so, regardless of the culture of the institution, would it really have fared much better now we're into tougher times if it hadn't been a bit of centralisation?
Well, if it had been allowed that the assets passed to local community control, democratic control within the local community, then those assets would belong to the community. They wouldn't belong to the state. So state cuts wouldn't have affected them. And Labour didn't have the courage to do that. Norman Glass, who invented Sure Start, said, anarcho-syndicalism came rather late for me between the arrival of New Labour and the Spice Girls' first album. But what he says, though, he went visiting the early years programmes, and he saw it as a people being fully developed and managing the programmes, and it was a fantastic example of what people are capable of given the resources. But we didn't give them the ultimate asset. The asset stayed in the control of Whitehall, and like I say, when Whitehall changes its colour, then ministers can come in and abolish it with the stroke of a pen, and that was a tactical error on behalf of Labour.
Well, they'd have had to have sort of spent money on buying the assets to give them away. I mean, transferring the assets wouldn't have guaranteed incomes to pay the people who run.
No, but if you transfer assets and land to local groups, you can generate income locally. You can get money coming in other ways. It becomes more self-financing. You don't have to rely on the state, and that's, like I say, a missed opportunity for Labour.
Do you want to just say something like
that? Listening to all of this, I mean, it's funny, like, people in the real world don't talk about the state and what the state might be. Actually, if you do focus groups with people, if anyone uses the phrase shrinking the state, people think it means like losing Cornwall or something like that. These kind of debates is so far removed from the kind of debates you might have on the doorstep. But a big issue is, I think some people have the views they do because they think of the state as something different to citizens. And indeed, it can be, particularly when, we're running around detaining people for 90 days. But the state is also an agency through which we exercise power. And I think a lot of your balance here is on the kind of state, the state at its best is an instrument of empowerment. And when I listen to the Tories, Sara's hit the nail on the head. For the Tories, shrinking the state is synonymous with empowerment, but in fact it will be profoundly disempowering for many people. And, whether it's, we should have had more regulation to tackle the credit crunch, or whether it's, wouldn't free universal care empower so many people in this country, actually the state can be an instrument of empowerment. So I think there's a big, I suppose the point I'm trying to make is, that the rhetoric of government handing down power to people sounds alluring, but sometimes we're most empowered when power is held centrally.
Thanks very much. And for fear of getting too centralised here, we'll come to questions in one moment, but I just finally, John, I wonder, could I just ask you to distinguish some of the things you were saying about decentralised institutions owned by communities doing things for themselves? In a word, what separates that from what David Cameron talks about when he talks about the big society? And if not much separates it, should we be worried about that?
Well, I think two things separate it. Number one, when I'm talking about it, I mean it. And I think the big society doesn't take seriously the idea that you've got to trust people in communities.